All right, so we're back. So where do we even start? We're talking
Yeah.
about acting white, the phenomenon of acting white. How, what are your thoughts about it? Do you think do you think it's a myth? Some people believe it's a myth. Others believe it's a real thing and it's sort of having an impact on how black kids or other kids of color, how they interact. They are failing classes because they don't want to seem to be white. So what are your general thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a, it's an accusation that is done within, like, within the culture. Like, I've never heard anybody, a white person tell me as in like a pejorative sense that you don't act black, or you don't blah 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 seem black, or you act white. Um so it is mainly, within the community. And I see it as a sense of, you're not one of us. Why aren't you white? Not one of us. And it's a way of, like, kind of maintaining cultural control over people, that, like, you have, in order to be one of us, you have to maintain a certain level of behaviors, speech patterns. And sometimes, yeah, sure, some people can be genuinely confused, especially if they live in a community in which doesn't interact with any other communities, right? I've spoken with some black people that are surprised that I have white neighbors, right? Or that they're surprised that, I work with other people of, like, white people, other people of other races, and that, they don't have a problem with me, I don't have a problem with them. And because they have this perception, and because they live in communities that are majority black, all their neighbors are black, all their coworkers are black, and their interactions with white people is very, very small compared to, what it would be like if you lived outside the community. And so, in a sense, a lot of people who are just in these very homogenous communities are sometimes genuinely baffled at how someone can live outside of the community, and how can someone be outside of the community. Like, they've never seen another black person in person, right, that doesn't talk the way that they talk, that doesn't, listen to the same music, speak like all same mannerisms, have the same problems. And so, if you're living in a very homogenous community, it's very hard to see, to define your life as being black, right? And all of your problems are associated with being black. And that if you lived outside of that, then all the problems would be the same. And you should be the same, right? They don't It's kind of like, a fish says to the water, like, how's the water today? And the fish is like, what the hell is water? Right?
Mm.
They don't understand that there's a difference, maybe in, like, hey, maybe you live in a community that, um does have a particular crime problem, does have its, like, poverty and et cetera, and they don't understand how those types of things, or, like, has a failing school system, and how those things would affect the people there. And it's not blackness that is defining a lot of the issues that they have in their lives, but it's those material conditions that they don't know what it's like, they can't associate they can't really pinpoint what the real difference is. The only thing that they see is white people don't have my problems, but they would never, like, go down to a trailer park and see white people actually have similar problems to them. But, because, again, they're not interacting with all different types of white people, they're interacting with their own, and they're seeing media images of what it is, like, what they believe it, like, all white people live like. So I think it's an issue of perspective and experience, and understanding how the whole spectrum of how all these people outside of their own communities live. Because just because you're very well versed in all the like, coming and goings of your community, doesn't mean that you have a definitive understanding of what is, like, it is like to be, like, in a different white community, right? Irrespective of income. Like, people obviously know that, like, income, like, the areas that you live in, there are different cultural differences. all across the country. But if you've never left your community, you're just going to assume it's all the same.
So, from what I'm getting, it seems as if much of the problem between racial groups in America stems from some sort of ignorance of the other side, of not being familiar with the issues the other sides have to deal with. Because if you are living in a community where you only get to interact with people of your own racial or ethnic group, then it's easy to see that it's easy to think that the problems you're having in your community is unique to you, that other people are not facing it as well. So, and maybe your only conceptualization of people outside your community is what you see on the TV, is what you see in the media, and they are not showing you the side of the other communities that's having the same problems as you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. And
there
also,
was this there was this video I saw of Robin DiAngelo, and she was talking about the first time she had met a black person, and she was so excited that she hadn't met any black people before, and this was probably in her 30s or so, and she was so excited, and she was just relating to them certain things that have, in essence, she was throwing her family under the bus. She was trying to paint her family as racist while she was the good one. But it just made the whole interaction very weird for the people she was interacting with at that point in time. I mean, you're just meeting us for the first time, and you're dabbling into all this racial stuff and trying to show you're an ally and all that. So what I got from that was that it seems like this woman is very ignorant of black people, black culture, and it can go both ways. Maybe the other side too, they're ignorant of white culture. So it's easy to make up stories about the other side because you don't know much about them. But what's fascinating to me is that the US is a multicultural society. So how is it possible that black and white people can live in the same country and they will have vastly different experiences there? It's almost as if they're still segregated. How is that even possible?
Well, I think there's a difference between like, yeah, I think there are some places where there aren't that many, minorities of any other race other than white people in a particular area, because it's kind of almost like, maybe the area just isn't that desirable to live in, right? If you're living in like a really rural town somewhere in Idaho, why would our black family randomly move there if there aren't even that many opportunities for white people there, right? So, but like a large city, a lot of people can go there and they would interact with each other. And so it's not even necessarily like, people self-segregate or like, I do see a lot of black people do intentionally try to self-segregate, but, I honestly, at least with the people that I interact with, it's almost kind of more common for a white person to, not really think a second thought about, interacting with people of another race. But, for black people, they kind of think too hard about like, oh, everyone here is like not black, and they kind of spin on that when I've never really seen a white person even like really notice it. And something funny happened like last time I went into the office, and I got a desk, right? And I got a desk, and there's this one white guy that I do work with, and I was kind of joking around with him, and not everyone was in the office, but he knew where everyone sat, and they had their name tag, right? And I realized where I was sitting was, all of the quote unquote all the people of color were like technically placed in like the back of the office, right? And he had never thought of that. He never like connected that, because I was like, oh, I sit here, and then Asian sits there, and then Tavita sits over there, and he's like, and then Audric sits there, he's like, and he's like, and Ernest sits there, and he's like, yeah, and then Stephanie sits there, he's like, yeah, and I'm like, and then when I phrase it like that, and it's like, and we're all over here, and then seeing it, the realization on his face as well, then he suddenly thought of it. It was to me it was so hilarious, right? Because he literally, like, I literally saw him just be like, what, like, why are you just mentioning all these names? Yeah, they're all here. I have no idea what what connects all of them. Right? And then he says like, oh my god, and it's like, no, it's fine. It's like, it's, I really don't think this was intentional. This is just where they were placing people. The office is, you know, and it's not, it's honestly, I have the biggest desk in the office. At least that's what someone told me. So it's like, it's not a bad place to sit. But it's just kind of funny of where it's more like, you know, quote unquote people of color were more likely to think of things in that way as opposed to a white person. He had no, he didn't, he never looked at people in that way. He just like, all these people are distinct people. But you know, it is people of color that would group us and each other in that way and put that layer of the way to view the world on the world, as opposed to white people doing that, right? And so it's just because I could have just never mentioned it, and he would just have like never ever had thought of that. Honestly, I mean, he mostly would think about like, you know, the issues of where he sits. He's like, well, you know, it's kind of you know, Kelly yells a lot, right? He, you know, and sometimes he has issues with Kelly, losing his, you know, getting angry and all that kind of stuff. That's something that he thinks more about. He doesn't think about race. He thinks more about people's personalities and how he gets along with people's personalities. But it's you know, when you think like that, it does change your behavior, because I think it was, you know, I do notice that some of the other people I work with are, you know, more race sensitive, and of course they're also people of color, and the reason why I say it, because like, you know, they're all not like classified as black, right? But it is it's interesting of like, suddenly someone will mention like, oh, like, you know, I'm in a conversation with some people and we're talking about like this, like, okay, we have all these plans and stuff, and then someone would say like, someone to say like, they would point out in the conversation, there are no white people in this conversation right now. Like there are more brown people in right here in this room, like concentrated in this room, than in all of the city, right? And it's like, okay, that was kind of random. I thought we were talking about like IT, but suddenly he just brings in race. But like, I would never like even when, you know, that guy I was talking to, even when he did think I was white before he met me, and when I was sitting in conversations with them, they wouldn't talk about like being white. They would just talk about, you know, like, this person's annoying, I'm having a hard time with this person, or, you know, this person can screw off, they have a difficult personality. They don't talk about like, oh, there are too many brown people around. They just talk about their personal, like, personality conflict issues.
That's interesting. So I have a particular clip, like a 2-minute clip I want to play, but before I play that clip, let me just follow up with this question. So is it that white people aren't really conscious about race, or they are very good at not talking about it? They are very discreet at not talking about it. They may think it, they may understand it, they may even understand the consequences, but in an open space, they're not going to talk about race. But whereas Black people, or maybe people of color, are much more willing to discuss racial issues. Is that what's going on there, or white people really don't think about race? What do you think?
I honestly, for the most part, I really don't think they think about race, but most of the time, I really don't think they do. But like, in this cultural climate, they're kind of, it makes it awkward, because like now for the first time, they notice that they are being expected to think of themselves as a racialized person, right? And it's very odd and awkward for them, because they have other identities that they have intentionally invested in, that they would choose to define themselves more by, as opposed to just being white. Like, again, those guys I was talking about, all of those guys were in the military. That's what they talked about. Like, that's what they, like, you know, they talked about, like, you know, 2 of those guys, they talked about being in the Marines, right? That was something that was part of their identity, not really whiteness, right? Another guy, he was a cop, right? He talked about being a cop. but not being a white cop because he worked with black cops. So it's like, it's being a cop isn't inherently associated with race to him because he worked with other different, cops of different, races, right? And so it's from what I can tell, for white people, they're kind of like, but what does that have to do with it? Like, for people who aren't, in the whole, mea culpa about like, I'm so sorry for being white, and they're trying to associate all their flaws with being white, and that thinking that they can improve, or maybe, make up for something like that. But for the people who aren't really in that, political or cultural headspace, it's kind of like, so what? Like, because they don't see that as being something significant. They think other things about themselves are more significant, that define, that speak more to who they are, as opposed to just the color of their skin, because it is kind of true. Like, the color of your skin doesn't necessarily define you as much as, like, if someone is from Brooklyn, right, and they're born and raised in Brooklyn, yeah, I can see that really defining them, especially their culture, how they speak, and how they, where they prefer to live, where their families are, and all the things that they are used to doing, because it's like you're in a big city, and versus like, I'm from Houston, or I'm from Compton, or I'm from Toronto, or all these different places. Like, those things, yeah, I can understand someone saying, I'm from this place, to explain a little bit more as to why they act the way that they do, right? Like, again, talking about like people that I work with, right? We have it's called a scrum master, who organizes all the tasks, right? He is so blunt. And he says like phrases that in some places will get like you canceled, but it's kind of like, this is him, is kind of a part of his charm, because he's a New Yorker, right? He speaks in such a blunt way that is particular to the East Coast, of like dense populations. You have to get through your day. You don't have time to chit chat with people. You just have to be blunt, get on, move on with your life. And so that is reflected in how he speaks to everybody, right? And like, he would say phrases like, I don't want to go down this rat hole, right? And like, that's a phrase I've never heard before. It's like, I don't want to waste time, right? And that makes more sense of him saying, I'm from New York, I'm from the East Coast, as opposed to, well, I'm white. That's what, like, that doesn't make sense, because you can have Southern people who are like, they like to, like, small town chit chat. Everyone knows everything about everyone. They want to like gossip or anything, like, that could happen. And it's like, those both of those populations could be white, but like, his blunt way of speaking, saying he's white, doesn't make sense to explain that, right? So it's, I think it's kind of a thing of, like, for people of color, like, we have to think of the things that make us distinct from white people, because especially, because we want to differentiate ourselves from, and that's just like an easy thing. Like, it's just an easy of like, I'm different because I'm from this culture, right? And instead of, and you don't really have to think as hard as to kind of your personality or like other things that you are really distinct in, because I would think that, like, honestly, sometimes white people, because they think that they're so plain, they kind of spend a little bit more time trying to figure out what makes them different, or trying to figure out their own different identity, as opposed to, like, if you're the black kid, quote unquote, in the school, well, you don't really have to, you already know what makes you distinct, so you don't really have to think that hard about it.
That's interesting. Really, really interesting. So Black people I can understand how a certain Black identity developed, because if you look at the Jim Crow eras, or going further back to the era of slavery, you had to forge an identity. You had to forge something that, even if not voluntarily, but by societal pressures, Black people had to forge an identity that was distinct. They had to band together if they wanted to survive, right? In those times. And I think that what we're seeing now is more a carryover from those times, where you had to act in a certain way. you had to be a certain way in juxtaposition to the white man who was the quote unquote oppressor at that time. So even though things have changed right now, they say old habits die hard. Those cultural patterns are still there, such that even when the battle is no longer being fought, even though the war is no longer being fought, the tactics and the strategies, it's like muscle memory that has been passed down from generation to generation. So, like your mom, like you would say, your mom looks at certain things that certain white people do, and then she wants to interpret it in a racial lens. That, okay, is this person acting this way because I am black? Now, you were not, if you were not Chloe, if you were maybe some other person, you could very easily take on those characteristics. You could very easily take on that mindset of your parents and see the world of your mother and see the world in that way, right? And even though it's not true anymore, that becomes sort of a reality for you. Even though it was true in the past and it isn't true anymore, but somehow that identity, which has been passed down from generation to generation, sort of perpetuates itself in the Black community.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And like the unfortunate thing, sometimes it also is trying to perpetuate itself in other kind of it does already happen in like other cultural spaces, right? Like for Native Americans, right? Knowing their history and knowing that they have been viewed as distinct, treated as treated by the government and as treated by culturally, and it is natural that if you are raised in a particular circumstance, you're going to develop a cultural identity around it. But I think that sometimes people just, not that it's not important, but they place a very specific unhealthy type of importance into it, as opposed to, yeah, this is my culture. Yeah, this is my identity. And, you can celebrate it and you can really invest your time and energy into it. But to carry on and perpetuate, in order to maintain that culture, you have to maintain the resentment and the pain and the, and the animosity. In order, like, well, we have to, like, inherently, in order to be Black or in order to be Native American, we have to, that inherently is in opposition to whiteness. And, you can, like, that's, I feel like is extremely unhealthy, to, think that in order to keep your culture, you have to keep the hate on a certain level, right? But I don't think that's true.
Wow. Okay, so let me play that video, that 2-minute video, and maybe we can get a few things from it and just react to it.
It's a term a lot of people of color have heard growing up, even when people just think it's a joke. The words, "you act white." What does that even mean? And what are the implications when someone says that? Victoria De Leon takes a look.
Whether it's the way we dress, the way we talk, or even the hobbies we take up, impressions can be made within seconds. For some, making a good impression doesn't always lead to a good experience.
But it wasn't really until high school that I started getting labeled as a white Black man, because I spoke, proper English. I did well in school.
Instead, it leads to the phrase, "you act white."
It's frustrating that even in my daughter's generation, she's 19 now, several people called her the whitest Black girl they know. She's like, because she talks proper, or because she skis, or because she snowboards. So, and they called her Oreo cookie, Black on the outside, white on the inside.
Sometimes it's said in a playful manner, but that doesn't diminish the racist sentiments behind it.
I find it strange that we correlate academia, intelligence with whiteness.
Miranda and Eloisa are two college seniors, both proud of their Chicana culture. They've been accused of acting white for simply doing well in school.
He's like, oh, she went to like a good school in Aurora, and just where I was located growing up. That's why they classify like, oh, whitewashed.
A 2019 study deconstructed the acting white phenomenon in Black and Latino college students. This is another in a long list of studies that dispels the idea that Black and Latino students don't do well in school out of fear of being accused by their own peers that they were acting white. Even in a playful manner, there's a sting that comes with being accused of not connecting with your own culture.
Well, I mean, you're messing with someone's identity, right?
And
Because
accusing someone of acting white sets up an ideal that shouldn't exist. And so these comments are often made by two people, by their own peers and people who look like them.
Now, something that really strikes me, two things that strikes me about this video that we just listened to is that certain things like speaking well, doing well in school, having proper diction and everything, things of that sort are associated with whiteness. And if a Black person is doing those things, other Black people would call them out as acting white. Now, so the question is are those good traits? Why would you look at someone who is who has certain good traits, and because the Black people that are referring to their fellow Black people as acting white, it's more like a derogatory term, right? It's not like it's a compliment. It's more like it's a derogatory term. So why would something good like doing well in school, why would it be same as derogatory within a certain community? How does that make any sense?
I think it's I do agree it's harmful in the sense of, unfortunately, like I said, like if you're in that particular water of that, those circumstances, and you're just going to associate, well, Black people aren't supposed to do good in the white system, right? Like they're making excuses as to why their circumstances are the way they are, and they just attribute it to, well, we're Black, right? And so I think it's harmful to associate, well, an essential part of being Black is being low economic status. And a lot of people of low economic status don't really have good test performance. They don't do well in school, right? And so to then culturally associate yourselves with those things, and when someone actually does well, it is kind of more so of a comment of, well, you're not like the other Black people, so again, by default, if you're not Black, you must be white, right? Because I don't think that there is this idea that all white people are doing great in school. I mean, that is actually more commonly associated with Asian culture, that you would be surprised to see. Like I remember there was I used to watch Mad TV, and there was a skit that not Ben Lee, but oh gosh, what is his name? That a comedian did, who's Asian, and the skit was, I'm just an average Asian, right? And it was this guy, or playing a teenager, right, sitting in Bobby Lee, that's his name, Bobby Lee, sitting in a math class, and everyone is asking him for math help, and he's like, I don't know, I'm not a genius at math. And he, at the end of the skit, he's like screaming on the top of his desk, I'm just an average Asian, I don't have all your math answers and all that kind of stuff, right? So, but it's yeah, sure, some of these things can be tied to history and to a certain population, but again, like I was glad that the clip kind of highlighted that these things are, when they said being seen by their peers, right, they kind of still dancing, they still were kind of implying that this is white people doing this to these people, but they and they're like, oh, it's by their peers and by people that look like them. It's like, yeah, like these are not like, a white person isn't going to say, oh, you're acting too white because you have good grades. Like, again, I've never had that the accusation happen to me from another white person. But again, I've had that accusation said to me from another Black person. And it's, and even to and sometimes I think it's funny where they still want to try to implicate white people. It's like, well, if white people didn't have like this standard, we wouldn't be comparing ourselves to them, but we'll be comparing ourselves to somebody, some group, always, right? And so just because there are probably on average more white people in this country, I guess by default we're going to be comparing ourselves to an idea of them, but it's like this idea of like, if they just weren't around, we would all be free of this one comparison and we would never compare ourselves to anyone ever. I would think that's ridiculous. But to hitch your wagon to an identity that is poor test scores, poor education, poor, like just being poor, right? I think that's not good, definitely. And it gives people anxiety that, like, well, I'm not going to be like my peers anymore if I start actually not abiding by that stereotype. Like we won't have something in common anymore. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Like it kind of shows sometimes how shallow the connections are we have with other people, of like, well, we're all poor, we're all friends, right? Like that doesn't mean that you're all like you're all the same and you all have the same issues. Like two people can be poor for two completely different reasons, right? One person can be, they have poor spending habits. Another person, can be in a really tough spot in the sense of they are stuck in a job that has low wages and they don't have enough money to afford to move to a place that has better wages, right? That doesn't make them the same, but people want to create these false cultural like categories of, if we have these same conditions, somehow we got there the same way and we're the same. And it's, it's different. People experience things differently because they could get to that same place from a different location and still go on to a different trajectory. And it's, I think sometimes it's expedient of like, if you're a new person at a school, just sit with the Black kids. You don't have to worry about finding friends. You just sit with the Black kids. You already have a pre-made group of friends to sit with, or to people that it's acceptable to sit with them. And it's harder to like, okay, like let's say you're a white person and you're new to a school. Do you automatically sit with the white kids? Do you sit with all the kids? Or do you like, you actually have to like, okay, like I actually have to find friends. How do I find friends? Right. And so sometimes these kind of pre-made categories are, it's easy, for like, you're a new Asian kid. Okay, I'll just sit with Asian kids, or yada, yada, yada. But like, it's, I don't think people realize a lot of the shortcuts that people do by relying on these categories to artificially associate with yourself with people. And then maybe it might take you a really long time to realize, I don't really like these people. Like, I mean, so that's one thing that happened to me. I used to sit with all the Black girls, right? None of them liked me.
Yeah, that's because you're white. You sound white.
But like, it didn't work, right? Just sitting with people of your same race, it just automatically doesn't work. They all shared probably other cultural traits, which made them more compatible with each other. But like just going my skin tone, it doesn't automatically mean you're going to share the culture. But people are assuming that skin color means culture, and that's not true.
Yeah, you see, I think it has to do with this human tendency to look for commonalities and taking the least path of resistance. So if you walk into a room and you don't know anybody in that room, you need to associate with someone. Who are you going to associate with? You're going to look for someone that has the most obvious characteristic that you can relate with. And most of the time, it's the skin tone, it's the skin color. Mm-hmm. You look around, you see a Black person. So at that point in time, since you don't have any information about the other people there, then it seems perfectly okay for you to gravitate towards the person who has the same skin tone as you. Then maybe later on you start figuring out, okay, I don't really align with this person. But where I think the problem comes in is when, even after finding out that, you don't vibe with this person who has this skin tone with you, or you connect more with someone who has another skin tone, but you still choose to maintain that, that association because of some form of solidarity of saying we must band together because we have the same skin tone, so therefore we should be together. That's where I think the problem comes in, not at the initial sort of interaction. If, for example, maybe I come to the West and I enter into a place and there are Nigerians, there are Ghanaians, there are different ethnic groups there. Naturally, I'm going to look for the Nigerians and try to associate with them first, right? Now, maybe as I interact with everybody there, and I find out that I have more in common with the Ghanaian, then I would have to start changing my alliances. But at that initial point, I think it's perfectly okay to go off based on what you think you have more commonality with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now this question I wanted to ask was, Melinda said something about that this acting white thing is actually true, and that kids get let me try and find that comment that she made about, it's not really a myth. People get beat on for doing well in school, so I don't think something that's only in their mind. So I want to relate this to performance. Now, if this is true, if what Melinda is saying is true, that kids actually get beaten for for acting white, or they get bullied for acting white. And you remember the other black guy in that video said something like, it's messing with your identity. Don't you think, or to what extent do you think that pressure is sufficient enough to get some black kids to lower their standards, or start speaking in a way that's not proper English, or start failing their classes just to be able to fit in, knowing full well that these are most likely teenagers who are very impressionable. So
yeah,
just
I do think that does happen, and honestly, that was like the subject of a whole movie of have you ever heard, like, it's like Sean Connery said, "You're the man now, dog." It's like, that whole movie was about a black kid who was doing very poorly in school, but he did a sorry about that. But he took a test, and they realized he was extremely smart, and that he was intentionally failing his classes. So what they did was they moved him out of that school and into another school where he didn't have his friends around, so that he could actually academically perform at the level that he could, right? And I think his mentor was Sean Connery, who was like who's an author or whatever, and that was the whole movie. But I do think that, again, when I said, like, they accuse that of people, right, in order to kind of sometimes culturally control them, right? Why are you why are you wasting time pleasing the white teacher? Why are you wasting time doing these white things? You should be with us, right? And that is a way of discouraging people from doing things that that person who's making the accusation, they have internalized that, and they do believe that, like, well, I don't do well in school because I'm black, so it gives them an out to not try. And if they see someone else possibly leaving them behind, they want to hold that person back so that they're not alone. And again, the person who is being pressured into failing academically to maintain friends, that is also, teenagers are very malleable and susceptible to peer pressure. And at that point in time, like, what is life without your friends? What is life without a social life, right? You have to have a very, very strong will to be like, no, I'm willing to not have friends and I'm just going to go and have good grades. How long does that, like, psychologically, for a teenager, how many teenagers would make that decision?
True. But I think it's a function of skill. How prevalent, how pervasive is this? If you want to put it in terms of percentages in the black communities, because it might just be in a cluster, it might just be happening in certain isolated quarters. And we can't use that. We can't extrapolate that and say this is representative of the majority of black communities. So, how pervasive is such a thing? Is it something that is found in most black communities, where if you are, like Melinda said, if you're doing well, and like the other people in that video said, if you're doing well in school, having good grades, having proper diction and all that, you're being bullied for acting white. It's almost as if you're supposed to rebel against the system, and one of the ways of rebelling against that system is to not do well in school, is to not speak proper English. But how pervasive is that? To what extent can we apply it to the most of black community in America?
I would think you would have to look at the the context of that Black community. Like if you're like in a community that is majority affluent Black people, I don't think that would happen, honestly, right? Like I've never been like, so surprise, surprise, most of my family's Black, but I've never been criticized by people in my family for doing academically well, because they all do academically well, right? They're all educated, right? I just got a text from my cousin probably the other day. She's finishing up her PhD, right? Like the idea of, you know, someone in my family that is not educated, that doesn't at least have like, you know, like, I don't know, like, okay, one of my cousins, software engineer, computer engineer, mechanical engineer, civil engineer, like a lot of engineers in my family, right? You know, and where they live, yeah, they do live in Black communities, but they're affluent Black communities where there are other educated Black people. So I don't think that happens in those contexts. But if you're talking about a poor community that has poor school system, that has a large dropout rate, that have people who don't go on to college, I would think in those spaces, they would have that association with doing well in school means that you're acting white, when if you're like, let's say in DeSoto, Texas or something like that, right? Or Baldwin Hills or whatever, you know, doing bad in school, it means, why are you doing bad in school? You can do better, right? They're not going to associate that with being Black. You're just a student.
So there's another component to this now. You brought in the socioeconomic component to it, which means that this isn't solely a factor of race. It's also a factor of socioeconomic standing, such that more affluent Blacks wouldn't have this problem as much as Blacks that are not as affluent. So is it really a racial thing, or does it have more to do with poverty? Is this a poverty thing?
I would honestly think it has more to do with poverty, right? So I have white friends who live in a trailer park, right? They did not have a good experience in school. And so I don't think that, you know, and for them, it's not normal to see one of their, you know, one of their peers go to like become an engineer or anything like that. That's kind of a novel thing to them. Now they won't say, well, you're not white. You're not white if you do good in school. They just believe it's something about growing up in a trailer park, that's part of their identity. You know, people from the trailer park don't do this. People from like, you know, if you're poor, you don't know how to do this, whatever. Like he texted me saying something like, oh, I actually went to a mall, and then like, because I like my ass was raised poor, I had no idea, don't approach the lady with the like don't do certain things, right? Like you know, growing up with no disposable income does mean that they did not have certain cultural experiences, but they relate it to, that's their part of their cultural identity, poor trailer trash.
That's fascinating. That's really, really fascinating. So maybe now the other part I wanted to touch on is have you had white people tell you that you speak so well, or you're so intelligent, you're so smart, and what do you think about that? What do you think of it when they make such comments? Because there was one video I watched earlier of one girl, I think she's the one I used in the thumbnail, where she was talking about how she gets that compliment that some white people may walk up to her and say, wow, you speak so well. And she doesn't see that as a compliment. In my mind, I interpret it in either of two ways. One is they might just be genuinely complimenting you that you do actually speak well. It may have nothing to do with the fact that you're Black and you are speaking well for a Black person. It may also have something to do with the fact that you're Black and they feel you are speaking well for a Black person. So which of these do you think is more appropriate?
Honestly, it probably depends on, you know, like, you know, when people say Obama, he was a good orator, he was a good orator, right? And that is a valid compliment. Now, there is, and I think it would depend on if they feel like this person is trying, right? So I watched a video, and it was this guy who he basically he taught himself Japanese, right? He taught himself Japanese in a way in which he sounds like a native Japanese person, where native Japanese people are very surprised to find out that he's not Japanese. Like if they just heard him speak, they would think he was a Japanese person. And he says basically what a lot of Japanese people say to non-native Japanese speakers is, "Oh, you speak Japanese well." Because the fact is they don't speak it well, but they know that they're trying, so they want to encourage them. Right. And he says, you speak Japanese well when they just have a conversation with you and they don't bring attention to how you speak. And so, but then when they find out he actually is a white guy who can speak Japanese very well, they actually may no, seriously, you do speak Japanese well, because he does. And so, but so there's those two things. And I also saw another video where it's like, there are these Reddit boards in which it says this am I ugly or something like that, in which what happens is people who do not have conventional looks, right, who are not considered conventionally attractive, they get more compliments on their photos because people want to be encouraging. But if people who are actually genuinely really good looking and they post on there, they get nitpicked to hell, right? And then until you kind of get to that threshold where yeah, you are objectively gorgeous and whatever. And so it can be possibly both, but it depends on what level someone is. Like if someone they can tell they have a thick accent, right? And they're trying to speak English well, or they're trying to get rid of their accent, they're trying to speak in proper diction. People want to be encouraging and say, you speak well. But if you get to the other level of you are objectively a really good speaker, you're really convincing, you can command a room, you would also get that compliment. So there's like this uncanny valley of, it could be, they're trying to encourage you and you're not really speaking that well objectively, but they're noting your effort, right? Or you are objectively a really good public speaker and they're saying you're really good. So I can't say objectively if someone says you're really smart or you're a really good speaker from that statement alone, if it's racist or not. Or it could just be that they're notice someone is trying and they want to encourage them. And is that really racist?
No, but in this sense, this example you gave of Japan, I think he may not work seamlessly. It doesn't translate seamlessly in the context of America, in the sense that Japan is a unique country. It's like, okay, Japan is a country on its own, so they don't really have much foreigners. But in the US, everybody speaks English, basically. Black people in America, their language is English. That's their first language. So what's the point of telling a Black person that you speak so well in the context of of encouraging them as though it's a second language? It's not a second language to them. It's their first language. So
it's
why
dialect.
are you
like it's
a dialect?
It's dialect. Like you're speaking very well. That you're speaking in a way that is going to move you forward in society, right? Like if it's not like like you can have such a deep accent that no one, like even if you're speaking technically English, no one is going to understand you, right? There's like so if there's this show King of the Hill, right? And then there's this character Boomhauer, and the joke about Boomhauer is no one, like most people don't understand what he's saying. He's a white guy, right? But he speaks in a very like Cajun accent. Same thing with like if the movies like Waterboy, like there's these Southern characters that have such a like that's how they talk. They're speaking English, but you couldn't really understand, it's like what they're saying. And so if so like there is a difference in accents and dialect that will change how people understand and interpret you. And if you clearly are speaking that your native dialect is one way and you're making an effort to speak in a way that other people can understand you, you probably would get that comment, right? Like, and even, and for, some Black, dialects, there's a scene in, I think, the first episode of the show Atlanta, in which there was, they were like in the drunk tank or something like that, and in jail, and there was this guy who, it's like a 5-minute monologue of him explaining how he got into jail. And I understood everything, but I played it for a white person, and who was not from the South. He was from like the Pacific Northwest, and I was like, did you understand any of that? He's like, no. I had no clue what he was saying at all. And they're like, again, just because we're all speaking English doesn't mean we all understand each other. And I think that is like it's not as simple as we all should just understand each other, because some accents get super thick, where you just have to I have no clue. You have to pay attention.
There's some British accents that I find very difficult to comprehend because it's just so thick.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, and I'm like, this guy is actually speaking English. Is this the English that I'm used to? These are supposed to be English people. Why are they talking like this?
Yeah,
it's as if they're speaking one native European language, and it's
it's
funny.
Or like Irish or Scottish. Like I remember, like there was this one thing. It was like, this person, like it was this Irish movie. They had to have subtitles. So it's, like, and again, just because like a Black person, like they think it's unique to them, but it's really not. It's really not, in the sense of.
But do you think that someone in England would tell an Irish, someone who speaks English with a very thick Irish or Scottish accent, will tell them that you speak English really well, as a way of showing that despite their accent, they are speaking English in a way that most people can understand it. Do you think that comment would ever?
They might not say that specifically, but I would imagine they would say other things, right? Probably said like, I didn't know you're Irish. I remember like there was a show called My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. And there was this one woman who basically, she worked in an office, and then she kind of told people like, oh yeah, she's getting married. And that was the time that people realized that she was Romani. And they had no clue that she was Romani, because she was a reliable office worker, because they have that stereotype that Romanis are, they're unreliable, they're low class, they're tricksters and all that kind of stuff. And there was even a park somewhere in the UK in which like a theme park or something like that, in which they were accused of racially discriminating against the Romani because they were banning certain names or something like that from the park. Like, if you have this last name, there's something going on that you wouldn't be allowed in the park or something like that. And I do see like they do have, like, I don't necessarily remember specific types of like what phrases, but they have equivalent phrases that they would say like, oh, I didn't realize that your whole family were travelers. That's like they didn't associate that with that person, because they associate being Romani or a traveler with all of these other traits that are, some of them could be negative, right? So like, just because that exact phrase isn't exactly said to an Irish person, or maybe they say like, oh, well, I expect you to drink more, right? Like, that whole stereotype of Irish are drunks, right? So it's just because, the exact thing isn't said. I doubt that they don't have their own equivalents of, oh, you're not like this racial group or this cultural group that I deem as having these distinct personality and cultural traits that I don't think you have.
Okay, so before I put the link to the show in the chat box, so anyone who wants to call in can call in. But before that, if you're watching this live stream right now, you're enjoying the conversation, please click the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, please click the subscribe button. And you can also support this show with super chats and super stickers. So now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the conversation. So Chloe, my next question is, in the US, is there a standard English? Because like in my country, even within the various languages, like let's take one of the major tribes and language in my country called the Yoruba language. There are different dialects, but there is a standard Yoruba which is spoken in where I currently live, which is Lagos, one of the biggest cities in terms of population size, even though it's the smallest state in my country, but it's the most densely populated state, over 20 million people. So there's a standard Yoruba, there are other dialects. So in the US, is there a standard English and that is sort of more acceptable compared to other forms of English, of which the Southern English and Black English and Ebonics are a part of?
Yeah, I would say I don't know exactly. I mean, yeah, there's this idea of like standard English and what we conceive of having no accent. And I think a lot of it is kind of established and determined by like Hollywood, because in probably like in the 1950s or so, or the 1940s, there was like this idea of a transatlantic accent, which actually didn't exist, but it was kind of normalized in the media as that's the proper way to speak, or that's the normal way of speaking. And so I think definitely a lot of the stuff like Hollywood definitely defines this for the most part, but there, I'm trying to think, but yeah, like a lot of things try to normalize to that, like that's the accent that Southern people try to emulate if they don't want to be associated with the South. Although like if the accent doesn't necessarily have like a negative connotation to it, people are likely to keep it. Like I've never heard of a British person trying to get rid of their accent when coming to the US. The US people,
yeah, the accent is well sought after and it's sort of sexy. So
yeah, it's considered like posh, intelligent, well-mannered, and all that kind of stuff. And so, like they're going to keep that accent. But and it depends. Again, it's the response that you get and the benefits that you would think of obtaining if you were to shed your accent.
That's fascinating. So, where haven't we covered in terms of this topic? We've covered impact of it. We've covered language part of it. We've covered attitudes part of it. Where haven't we covered? So the link is in the description. No, the link is in the chat. If you want to call in and have a conversation with us, with Chloe and myself, please jump right in. So Chloe, where do you think we can take this conversation right now?
I don't know. I mean, you can probably get into code switching, because in order to reconnect with people, sometimes people choose to talk in another way, to like accents are a way of connecting, right? And to distinguishing yourself, like I'm different. So the like Templar, I understand that not that many people have that posh, educated accent, but it's kind of like it's the halo effect, right? Still, even like a Cockney accent in comparison to the American accent, we think that sounds posh relative to the American accent.
Hey, Steve.
But yeah, like, hey, Steve. But yeah, code switching is probably another aspect of it, to like reconnect or reaffirm your cultural connection after quote unquote talking white.
Okay. So we're going to get into code switching, but let's hear Steve. Steve, welcome to conversation. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. How are you guys doing?
We're fine. We're having fun. We're having a very interesting conversation. Actually enjoying this so much.
Yeah, I apologize. I missed the last about. Sorry?
I said I'm enjoying it more than I thought I would.
I have to apologize. I missed about the last 20 minutes because I was talking to my wife, but there was something that I wanted to say, to what you guys were talking about earlier, and the whole discussion about acting or talking white or talking black. You know what that basically is. I mean, if you're looking at in-group, out-group bias, what you're doing is you're saying you sound like the enemy, right? So we're making enemies out of the other group, and this is that standard dichotomy between good and bad, or superior and inferior. And that's the thing that I think we really should be focusing on is why is one group inferior to the other, or why is the other group superior to the other one? So when you say, why are you acting white, what you're doing is you're basically elevating whiteness above what you should be, which is yourself, right? So we're comparing like to not like. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
And also, like, I would go on.
Sorry, I would just wanted to say, it's we all know that I've written about this, but I mean, this is a classical example of what race lining looks like in action.
Mm-hmm. And like, I wouldn't even necessarily say that, all the time it isn't necessarily that, is saying you're acting white, that you are degrading, like the black person is degrading themselves in relative to a white person, because let's say it's like, why are you doing so doing well in school? That's lame, right? That's what lame people do. They don't have as much fun as us. And that is also another way that I think it also is said, as a way of putting white people down as like they're lame losers who don't have their food tastes bland, they talk like they're plain, they can't dance, and they don't have good taste in music.
They can't dance.
Well, yeah, what you're doing is you're providing an outline of expected behavior or ideals based off of subjective standards, quite frankly.
Steve, can you dance?
I can actually dance.
You can dance. Wow. Chloe, can you dance?
No.
Charles, can you dance? No. So it seems as if it's Chloe and I that are the white people here now, and Steve is the black person.
Oh man.
My goodness.
Yeah, but I mean, what we're basically doing is we're outlining the requirements for you to be allowed into our acceptable group.
Right.
And those limitations, those boundaries are almost always going to be subjective guidelines, which makes them not really guidelines at all. You know what I mean? They're kind of like, they're more like examples of what not to be, instead of actually telling me what it is and what the in detail, give me a description and an explanation of why this means this, right? This means something bad, and they won't be able to do it.
Well, but it also dictates of like, when someone, like, especially in those examples, it is also a way of trying to dictate what their priority should be, right? If someone's going to say, I can't, like, it's like, no, I'm not going to go to the party, I have to study. It's like, you act white, right? And the reason why they're saying that is like, no, you're going to do what I think you should do and do the thing that I want to do, right? If the person was doing something that, or their behavior was, I don't know, like something they didn't really care about this person, they didn't care what they did, they wouldn't really say anything to them. But because they have a certain association with that person, and that person doing something different from them makes them feel a certain way, they're going to, rely on this authority of what it means to be X cultural identity, right? In order to control their behavior.
Right. Well, the interesting thing too is I was reading Nietzsche the other day, because that's what you do when you're bored. And I was specifically reading up on his idea of master and slave belief systems, and it was really fascinating, because what he said about the slave mentality is that you will adopt everything that is opposite of what the master is, and everything that is opposite is good. So if well, I'm not going to go down that line of reasoning. I think I've said enough there, but I think that's a very profound observation that he made, because it does seem like when we look at someone and we meet someone and we see the way that they behave, it's not something that we would say would be commensurate with what would be expected. Do you know what I mean? So it's like if someone was to be like, hey, why are you acting black? You're not black, right? And the thing that they're trying to tell me is that there's a certain expectation that I am supposed to behave a certain way that is opposite of this other group, purely because it's opposite of what that group does.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the whole point behind that concept, is that, in their way of saying it, if you follow critical race theory and they say, well, whiteness is work, hard work ethics and being on time and all these other things. What you're saying to that person when you're saying that, they're not black enough, or why are you acting white, is you're saying, well, being on time is a bad thing, or having a strong work ethic is a good thing, or being interested in your own intellectual welfare is not something that we hold as a value. So they're actually, what they're doing is they're creating a criteria for you to fail. That's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
All based off of these subjective, ideas of what is acceptable and unacceptable, and on top of that, mixing in the fallaciousness of race in the first place.
Yeah, and like I've had people who and of course they associate, like, just like you said, like anything that's the opposite of the enemy is good, right? And I've had friends who they liked me, or they we got along or whatever, but they made certain assumptions about me because they thought I was a good person, right? And so they assumed that I was poor because they thought that being poor is a virtue, as opposed to being affluent or having savings and having money and having some level
Right.
of financial freedom, right? And so I like, sometimes I remember they would make certain comments of like, oh yeah, and then fuck landlords and fuck property owning, and it's like, okay, I don't think you remember or realize I own my house. Right. And so they sometimes say certain things, and it's like, I don't think you realize that you're saying you hate me, but you don't associate those things with me. So we've never had that like animosity. But like when, they're talking about, like, they were talking about something of where I think they were playing a game called Persona 5, and there was a high school girl who was academically like considered overachieving, right? And he's like, I hate girls like that. And I'm thinking, that was me.
Wow.
And but he didn't but because we got along with these other things, and he didn't see me as like stuck up or whatever, he just didn't associate that like that is like I was someone that had those traits that like it was like that he just hated, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like, I don't think you realize, like, or maybe like do you realize that you hate me, but you don't realize you hate me? I don't get it. Right.
Well, it's not supposed to make sense though, Chloe. You know what I mean? So when I was going to school, I specifically did not go to school because kids who were smart got teased, and I didn't want to get teased. So I intentionally failed at school.
Wow,
And
Steve.
yeah.
So
yeah.
basically, this is the version of acting white. You were basically acting white, or you would have been accused of acting white. I mean, you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And you did not want to act white, so you decided to fall out of school. That's interesting.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So same mentality, different words and examples, but same mentality. And, now in my 40s, I'm kicking myself in the ass for not doing better and just saying, screw it. Fuck you guys. I'm out. I'm going to do well in school because I want to. Because I wasn't stupid. Like when I applied myself, I was perfectly capable of doing the work. But I was so afraid of being teased. I was so afraid of being a member of the out group that I did whatever I could do to stay in the in group. And it wasn't until I had age and maturity behind me that I was able to break that stupid ass ideal in my head that smart people are bad. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, obviously I was much older. I was in my 20s or 30s by that point, but you know, that concept held me back for so long. And I think that's why all of a sudden I just decided to start reading like a maniac. It was just like I had finally cast that aside and was just like, screw this shit. I know I'm smart. And so I just dived into everything that I possibly could. And I really started to explore my intellect and, you know, the way that I thought. And I started testing myself and testing my ideas and putting them out there. And my life has been enriched far more since I've been able to get rid of that stupid concept in my head. And that kind of explains so much of my life.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. So if this could have happened to Steve, where did this idea come from that you didn't want to fall out of your peers? Was it sort of a socioeconomic thing? But how did that come to have so much of an impact in you? What kind of community did you grow up in that being good in education was seen as something negative, and you had to shove your education just so you seem cool with the other kids?
Yeah. I think it was just a childhood observation, really. You know, all the nerds who wore glasses did really good, you know, carried all their books in a book bag, did really well. You know, they always got teased, and I didn't want to get teased. I wanted to wear the cool clothes, and I wanted to be with the cool kids, which never worked out for me anyways. So I don't know why I kept doing it, but I think it was just an observation that I made. You know what I mean? Smart people make average people feel dumb. And you tease what you don't like, and you criticize what you don't like, and you try to destroy what you don't like. And I think it was a childish observation that I made. Socioeconomically, I grew up very poor. After 9 years old, my father made really, really good money until I was 9. And then he was forced to medically retire, and that cut our household income by 2/3. And so we became very poor almost overnight. And I grew up in a fairly wealthy neighborhood. So it was really difficult, not only being poor, but if I was smart on top of that and did well in school, oh man, I would have been miserable. So I did what I could to decrease my, you know, I basically did a very elementary cost versus benefit analysis and said that, well, it's not worth the cost of my own happiness and security to be intelligent and do well in school. So therefore I am going to be the opposite of that. And I'm at least going to try and find some kind of profitability in my social system.
Mm. So it seems that this is not just unique to the Black community, that there are versions of this in other communities as well. So if this is...
Well, I would have to expect Black people or, you know, racialized Black people are human beings too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. They are, of course, they're human beings too. But I used to have this idea that this so-called acting white thing and kids not wanting to perform well in school just because they want to seem cool with their kids was more of a Black thing. But now from the perspective you're giving to me, it seems more like a universal American experience. So why has it been heralded as if it's a Black thing, that the reason why Black kids are failing is because some of them don't want to act white, quote unquote? They don't want to act white, so they are intentionally failing. How come similar things are not being reported for other communities when these things could very well be happening in those communities as well?
Well, I remember someone saying something in a podcast I watched somewhere, and I wish I could be more specific than that. But I specifically remember them saying, you know, if I did well in school, my peers would criticize me. And I mean, you just played the clip just a minute ago, or like, you know, 30 minutes ago of Chicano women getting shit for doing well in school and be like, hey, why are you being white? You know what I mean? And I mean, this is something that we've heard in almost every single, racial demographic across the nation. I mean, you ask anybody, almost anybody, you're going to still have that same concept present in almost every community. I don't want to say all, because I've never been to all communities in the United States, but I have a hard time believing that something that is so common that there's actually a cognitive term for it would be only, based in one demographic. I mean, I have to believe that I think it's a human trait. It's a human flaw.
Yeah, like the only kind of exceptions of the communities are communities that like intentionally, heavily, maybe sometimes to their detriment, focus on academic performance, which is, we think like of the Jewish community or the Asian community, right? Like, you don't really see very many people in America committing suicide over the fact that they think they failed the test, but you would see that like in Korean schools, right?
Right.
And it does depend on what the culture at large does focus on, or like the culture that you are inculcated in, right? Like you can, like I'm pretty sure if you're living in like an Asian American community and all of your friends' parents focus on academics, your parents focus on academics, so you're not an odd person out for focusing on academics. Everyone does it. And for someone to like, kind of fuck off and like, they do something else, they're the black sheep, right? But I think that like, I mean, just look at American culture in general. I see like, there is a pride in being extroverted, being, risk taking, maybe being a little bit extra, like, all of these things that are kind of the opposite of being careful and studious and quiet. And so that's how we have like this whole, formerly a cultural phenomenon of like, yeah, nerds get beat up, right? That's why they have movies like Revenge of the Nerds, because those are people that, people like, yeah, they would seek revenge because they've been beaten up their whole life and they've been made fun of. And then finally they have a movie in which they get back at everybody. That is, because let's just be honest, being a nerd isn't fun relative to what everyone else is doing, right? You're not going to football games, you're not going to parties, you're not drinking, you're sitting in your room in front of a computer or a book and you're studying, right? It's there is a benefit later on. And so that's why, now suddenly being a nerd is kind of considered being sexy and exciting, because they are experiencing the benefits of being, not having fun early on, but now they have very lucrative jobs where they now can, spend their money, and they now actually have the financial freedom of doing what they want and being associated with, a cool lifestyle because they can afford it. And so it's, there is this, a kind of a cultural, but then, sometimes they start adopting the things that they, did not have the chance to do before, right? Like I read an article in which, a lot of software engineers, coming to, the Seattle area completely changed the dating culture and landscape, because now, a lot of women noticed that the guys that they were going on dates with, because they were going like, these are guys who are affluent guys, right? And so, for the first time, they can actually get all these dates, right? And then they were noticing all these guys are, there was something particular about them because they're probably the first time in their, family's generation that they had like 6-figure income. They could spend on what they wanted. And so they did behave slightly differently, as opposed to people who always had money. And I think that, and so like, now they have a chance to act like the jock, right? To get girls, to spend money on fast cars, to, maybe sometimes act like a jackass, but, they are banking on the thing that, this, my intellect paid off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've spoken about this before, but a lot of women look for one of two qualities in a man, which is a provider or a protector. And if you've got both of them, you're not going to be single for very long. You know what I mean? So like I grew up a very small kid, so I was obviously not a protector, so I had to become a provider. And so I worked my ass off at my career and I make really good money. Well, now I'm much bigger than I was when I was a child, and now I'm a provider and a protector. And so I'm, obviously I've been, with my wife for 8 years, and, it's one of those things where it's like in the evolution of human beings, our mates, our female mates wanted someone that could protect them from the other aggressive apes. You know what I mean? Either with food or with security. And I think after, several hundred thousands of years, we've continued to adopt that mentality because it paid off evolutionarily wise.
Right. But yeah, I guess also getting back to like the topic at hand, like, like being different has always been poked fun of and made fun of, right? If you're divergent from the norm in the community, like either you band together with the other people who are the same type of weirdos you are, and just at least in the immediate, you can enjoy, like, okay, you're all music nerds, or you're all theater nerds, or whatever. You're all banding together, and then you create your own identity around us versus them, right? And then you have your own, like, well, people are in band, do this. Why are you going to the football game unless you're in pep band, right? So I think it's just human nature, and I think it is very short-sighted to think that it's just a black and white phenomenon. Like if we were all the same skin tone, race, whatever, we would still say, hey, you act like a jock. You're supposed to come to chess club.
Right. Well, it's in our nature to be dichotomous human beings. We have a habit of choosing or believing that there's only one of two options available to us. And the wisest thing that we can do is realize that there are far more options than just one or two. Like this is not a binary kind of an idea here that, you can both succeed and be a provider and a protector and an emotional partner. You can be all the things, right? But if we don't break out of that dichotomous nature, we never really get to see the potential that we have. And, something that Anon is, asking in the comments, I don't want to get into it too much. He says, why are so many high income American males unmarried, including high income African American males? Well, I think there's an obvious reason for that. It's because the dating pool is no longer what it was when it could be a benefit to us. Why should I get married so half of my things can be taken? I can pay for my wife's house, pay for my children, and have half of my money garnished from my check. It's not cost beneficial to me to do that anymore. So what we've done is we've worked ourselves into a damn corner, and worked ourselves into a situation where for the first time in history, some countries and some locations, their population is actually starting to decrease. Like in Japan, they're not having children at the same rate anymore. In the US, I wouldn't be surprised to see the birth rate drop in the next 5 to 10 years, especially when you consider the fact that, the male sperm count has dropped by a significant amount. A 22-year-old male in the US today has the same sperm count as a 50-year-old male in the 1990s. Like there's a significant serious problem here.
Well, there's also like, as culturally we've gotten more affluent, right? Like the idea associated with how much a baby costs, right? My friend, she says things like, we used to have these things in caves. It really isn't that expensive to have a baby, but because if you're in a culture where you have to have a baby Bjorn, you have to have, 2 types of strollers, you have to, get them into preschool, you have to, get them in all these activities, you have to get them, they can't wear, too many old clothes. And, we, as a culture, we make having children expensive, and naturally
$1,000 a month for one child where I live.
And so
$1,000 a month. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And so like it's just all these cultural expectations of, you know, what we need to provide for children, and also what we need to do ourselves. Like, you know, especially like, you know, there's like, I think I saw like a video of one woman saying like, you know, I'm spending so much money on childcare, but then it was revealed as to how much money she was making in her job, and she really wasn't making money. And so it's like, actually that cost benefit analysis, you would save money quitting your job and just being a stay-at-home mom at this rate. But
And then you're married to the state.
Yeah. Well, then if she was married, so her husband had a good income. And they were dipping into their savings, trying to pay for childcare. So,
Right.
And so, yeah, that is.
Well, when I was married to my second wife, she didn't have a career. And so she would have been making, you know, slightly more than minimum wage. And I told her, until you can make at least enough to cover the child care cost, it's stupid for you to work. I will work. You watch our son. We'll save $1,000 a month. You know what I mean? And so it was the cost benefit analysis was, it was better for her to not work because it costs so dang much.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, but like,
but I have a question. Why are people so eager to work in place of raising their kids? Why are people so eager to pay money for other people to raise their kids, just so they could go work a job that might not even pay for the childcare? What's going on there?
It's an association with, you're an empowered woman. This is what empowered women do. You work. You're not like, you know, it's kind of, unfortunately, there's this association sometimes with being a stay-at-home mom as being a weak, submissive woman. And they want to defy that stereotype. So they, you know, make sure that they are focused on their career because they don't want to be a weak woman.
That's so backwards.
Mm.
It really is, Charles. It really is. And, you know, for men, it's much the same way. It's, you know, we don't want, you know, there's a lot of men out there that absolutely refuse to be seen as a deadbeat father. So we work so dang much that, you know, we eventually, you know, kill ourselves from exhaustion. But we just work and work and work and work to cover enough expenses, and hoping that our family will love and appreciate our efforts. But at least the one thing that you can't tell me is that I'm a piece of trash and a waste of society. So there's a social pressure component to the discussion.
Yeah, like I remember my friend, like I didn't go to an Ivy League school, like, and she went to Notre Dame. And she, you know, at one point she's like, well, why don't you just try? Like, you know, why are you just going to go to like this, you know, stay in the state and yada, yada, yada. You're smart. Like, why don't you? And I was like, I don't want debt. Right. And she has debt. She definitely has debt. But, you know, there is just, you know, there's all these expectations of, you know, why don't you? You know, like you could, like, this is associating a certain state with a betrayal of potential, or what you should be, what you should aspire to be, right? You know, I see a lot of this stuff with, like, you know, like with younger generations, right? And I guess, like, I think statistically they're viewed as, like, actually they're more materialistic than other generations because they have this expectation of, you know, through social media, this is what you should be, right? This is what you could be, right? And so they are, you know, they realize that they can create a silo, which they are the star of their own show, you know? And so they act that way. And if they're not, you know, living like this enviable life, and if they're not, you know, presenting this image, you know, that is somehow what is, you know, you can't be that. You can't just be normal. Like there is a kind of fear of just being normal, which, let's be honest, the vast majority of people statistically on average are going to be normal. there's no way around it. And it's, I think it's a losing game of if everyone is trying to be at the same time exceptional, which in the same way, or like it's just not going to happen. And there's a kind of like a loss of humility, and just like, you know what, yeah, I'm probably going to marry, you know, I'm not going to marry a model or whatever. Maybe I should just recognize, you know, what I want in life and figure out how I can be satisfied, instead of, you know, valuing themselves after being enviable or being, you know, like matching this image of, you know, fast moving, risk taking, being out there and always having everyone eyes on you and everything.
I'm curious what Charles has to say about this, because I'm curious as to what the general social consensus is about education in places like Nigeria.
All right, so let's end the stream. Then we'll just go backstage and talk about that. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so thank you guys for coming to the stream. This is what we'll call it quits for today, and I'll catch you guys in another live stream. But Chloe and Steve, please just stay back so that we can talk.
Okay.